kind of excited about today's message? And you're like, wait, you're not excited every Sunday? Well, I am. And I used to think, right, you'd hear a Bible teacher say, oh, this is my favorite passage of the Bible. And then like the next Sunday, it's like, oh, it's my favorite passage of the Bible. And you're like, it seems kind of fake. But it happens, right? As you jump in, it's like, oh, it's wherever we're at, it's my favorite. And so it's not meant to be disingenuous, but it's just as you dive into this stuff, you're like, oh, this is so good. And then it's like, oh, this is so good. And so guess what today? Oh, this is so good. So we're going to start Matthew 21. Matthew 21 to the end of the chapter, or to the end of the book, which is chapter 28, is the last week of Jesus' life. Okay? And it's actually a third of the whole book. So a third of the whole book is dedicated to basically 7 days of Jesus' life. So, what does that tell us? Well, I guess we can conclude that the last week's pretty important, but it also gives us kind of a highlight or a little bit of understanding of the previous 3.5 years, right, roughly. Jesus has been in ministry for 3.5 years, and 2/3 of the book has been covering that. So it does, in the Gospel of John, John says that, not everything was written down about Jesus, because if it were, it'd fill all the books in the world. So as we look at this, the last week is 1/3 of the book, previous 3.5 years is 2/3 of the book. So yeah, I can see that there was probably some details that weren't recorded. It's just how it is. But here, we're jumping in. We've got the last week, and I'm going to start out with Matthew 21, verse 1. But before I do, I want to pray. Father, we ask that you would be in our midst. We're going to open your word, and we're going to learn about you and the amazing and mighty things that you did while you were here. We just ask that you would open our hearts to this. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so let me read this first one. It says, now when they drew near to Jerusalem, they came to Bethphage, to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus sent 2 disciples. Let's stop right there and let's look at the map. We got Ron jumping early here. So we're going to look at this. Oh, look at that. So there's Bethphage up there on the right, kind of at the top. Yep. And then you can see out here's Bethany. We're going to talk about Bethany in a little bit. And then you see the zigzaggy line over there. This is going to be the path of the triumphal entry. And you can see right below, you can see the Kidron Valley. Those squiggly lines, right, if you're not an engineer, right, generally, when we see squiggly lines, it means it's going to be steep, right? So they've got to switch back and forth so it's not so steep. So that's what that means. And you can see it's coming out of the Kidron Valley. And right up there, he's going to come in what's called the East Gate. And you can see where the temple is. Yep, temple right there. So that's where we're talking about as we look at this. So this is Jerusalem. North is up the page. And so Bethany's, you can see we've got a scale down there, a mile. So walking, it's only a couple of miles, right? But this is where the triumphal entry is going to happen, basically on that course as he's leaving Bethphage. So far, so good? So let's look at the first East Gate picture. So Jesus is going to go in the East Gate, and if you look, you see the Dome of the Rock, all right? Don't freak out. But what used to be at the Dome of the Rock? The temple. Yeah. And so now the Muslims have their temple there, or their Dome of the Rock there. And if you look to the right on the wall, you see that East Gate. Yeah, right there. That's the East Gate. And in front of it, it's kind of an interesting picture right here because this picture is from the Mount of Olives. Okay, that's going to play quite a bit in this last week of Jesus' life. It's interesting that in front of the East Gate currently, you can see what's going on there. Well, that's actually a cemetery in front of the East Gate. And those of you that got the sharp eyes, you're going to say, it looks like the gate's closed, like it's all rocked up. Well, we're going to look at that. And if you look close to where the picture's taken, you see those boxes? Yeah, that's another cemetery. Okay, the cemetery up here is Jewish, and the one over there is Muslim. Interesting. Let's look at the next picture. Oh, it's a little bit better picture. We're kind of zoomed in a little closer. Now we're kind of down in the Kidron Valley looking up. And so where the dome is, that's where the temple would be, right? And this is where Jesus is going to go in, the east gate on the triumphal entry. And you can see it's all blocked up. Well, how did Jesus get in when it was all blocked up? Well, the obvious answer is it wasn't blocked up when Jesus went in. Okay? And in front of it, you can see all these graves. What is that about? Well, this goes back about 800 AD, right? The Islamic faith is starting to grow. And so I don't know if you're aware, but the Jews and the Muslims haven't gotten along for a long time. A really long time. And so what happened is in the 1500s, the Muslims, and they'd fought back and forth. And so actually as early as the 800s, they had blocked up this gate. And then the Jews regained control, and then they opened the gate. And they fought back and forth till in the middle 1500s. What happened is the Muslims finally blocked that thing up, closed it up. And then they said, you know what else we're going to do? Is we're going to put a cemetery in front of it. Okay? So why did they do that? That seems kind of strange. Well, there's a couple of reasons. One of them is, as we looked at that map, we don't have to look at it now, but in that map, if you remember, there was the Kidron Valley. Okay, so what happens strategically, if you're controlling Jerusalem, you got this big gate, right? Do you need all these gates to get into the city? Probably not. But this one is by this valley. And so in this valley, it's easier for military forces to come in that valley, sneak up, and come in that way, right? So you know what? If you block that up, that would help strategically. However, there were prophecies that the Messiah would come in the east gate. Okay, well, the Jews were like, well, we're still waiting for the Messiah. And the Muslims are like, well, we're going to make sure your Messiah doesn't come. We're going to block up that gate. We also know that a good Jewish leader would be defiled if they stepped over a cemetery, right? You become ceremonially unclean. So they're like, oh, look at this. Win-win. We'll block up the gate so their Messiah can't come. We'll put a cemetery in front of it because they won't walk over the top of it, and then our problems will be solved. Okay? So that's why that gate's blocked up. It's a very classic image, you know, as you look at this, all that's going on. Well, the interesting thing, and you might be saying, wow, did God know this was going to happen? Right? Did this take him by surprise? Well, look at Ezekiel 44. We're going to look at this passage, just kind of interesting, kind of makes you go, I'm going to read this. It says, this is in Ezekiel. Ezekiel is in captivity, and he has this vision. And it says, then he brought me back to the outer gate of the sanctuary, which faces east. Oh, I know that gate. And it was shut. And the Lord said to me, this gate shall remain shut. It shall not be opened, and no one shall enter by it, for the Lord, the God of Israel, has entered by it. Therefore, it shall remain shut. Right? So it's like, oh, let's go back and look at the picture. So this prophecy says that the Lord's entered the gate, and now it's going to remain shut. So, right, if you're an enemy of God, and you're like, I've foiled your plans, it's like, well, you knew a little bit of the Bible, but you didn't know it all, because I knew you were going to shut the gate. And that's okay, because Jesus has already entered through that gate. Okay? So, Jesus, however, in our story is about to enter the city of Jerusalem. And now we see a dramatic change in how Jesus addresses the people. Okay, previously, he was always kind of on the down low, right? If there was a big crowd and they wanted to make him the king or whatever, he'd be like, let's not do that. But now there's going to be a change. And let's go to verse 2. of Matthew 21. So remember, he's at Bethphage on the Mount of Olives. We saw that in the map. And it says, he said to two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village in front of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied, and a colt with her. Untie and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, you shall say, 'The Lord needs them,' and he will send them at once." This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, saying. Let's stop there. So Jesus says, hey, I need you to go into town. And he says, you're going to find a donkey tied. And there's a lot of debate. And to me, it's interesting when people get into these debates about stuff like this. So the question is, Jesus told these two disciples to go get this donkey. And if somebody says, hey, what are you doing? Say, the Lord has need of it, and they'll let you go. Okay? Now, there's one camp of people that say, oh, this is clearly a miracle, supernatural. Okay? And then the other camp is like, well, Jesus probably had friends in that community, and he probably said, hey, I'm going to need a donkey. Can you help me out? Yeah, sure. And so so it could have been prearranged, or it could be supernatural miracle. I'm okay with either one, right? But people get into arguments about it, and then it gets kind of ugly. But personally, I think probably prearranged, right? Jesus knew people. And can you imagine? Right? Jesus is like, you know Jesus in his ministry in the world. It's like, hey, Jesus, if I can do anything for you. And Jesus is like, man, I need a donkey. And it's like, hey, I have a donkey. Right? Would you be willing to help Jesus out with your donkey? Well, absolutely. No question asked, right? And if some guys show up and they're like, hey, we're coming to take this donkey. Like, hey, what are you doing? Oh, the Lord needs it. It's like, oh, this is it. Jesus needs the donkey. So anyway, so he gets this donkey. And the reason you're like, well, why does he need a donkey? He's walked everywhere else. Verse 5, it says, say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden. And it says, then his disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. And they brought the donkey and the colt and put on them their cloaks, and he sat on them. All right, so he goes, and the reason he does this is because there's a prophecy that says your king is going to be coming on a donkey, right? And you're like, a donkey? Does this mean something? Right? If it's weird, and that's kind of weird, usually that means it's important. And sure enough, it is, because a donkey is a symbol of peace. Okay, you know, we think of a dove, right, today with an olive branch. Oh, that's a symbol of peace. Well, back then, a donkey was a symbol of peace, right? If you're riding a donkey, it's not like, okay, sorry to use this, but it's like a 770 Rambler. Okay, is that a super muscle car? No, right? It's just a working man's kind of car, right? Now, if it was a Camaro, right, that's what you would expect Jesus to I'm going to come in a Camaro, big muscle car. Instead, he's like, nah, I want to come in a Rambler, because that's a humble man's vehicle. You follow what I'm saying? Same kind of thing, but in this time and in this place, a donkey was a symbol of peace. If a king's coming to you on a donkey, do you feel threatened? No. Right? So that's what's happening here. He's coming on this donkey. And they start laying their cloaks on him. And it says, verse 8, most of the crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. And so this is where we get Palm Sunday, because they're kind of like laying out the red carpet, right? You've seen that when dignitaries come off the plane and they have a literal red carpet and they walk. Well, they didn't have carpet then, but they take their clothes and their palm branches and they make this special path for Jesus to come into the city. Verse 9, and the crowds that went before him and that followed him were shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. And when he had entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, who is this? And the crowd said, this is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth. So he comes into the city, and like I said, this is a shift, right? He's kind of center of attention today. A lot going on. And it says the whole city was stirred up. And you might be thinking, the whole city stirred up, Jesus? Wait a minute. Remember when the wise men came into Jerusalem, right? That caravan of wise men seeking Jesus, it said the same thing, that the whole city was stirred up. So there's a couple of times in Jesus' life that the city got stirred up. And so the city stirred up. Jesus has come in, and they're like, who is this? What's going on? It's Jesus of Nazareth. All right, let's go to the next section. And what happens is verse 12. It says, and Jesus entered the temple, and he drove out all who sold and bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he said, it is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers. So what's happening here? So Jesus goes into the temple. We saw the temple, and there's kind of a layout in the temple where there's the actual temple, and then there's some outer courts. And then the farthest outer court was the temple of the Gentiles, and that's kind of important, and we're going to look at that. But he goes into the temple, and he sees these money changers, right? Money changers, as I call them, the banksters, right? We have money changers today. But not to the level of corruption this was, if that's even possible, but it's true. And it says he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he says, it is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers. So he's upset that, and so some Christian churches sell books in a bookstore, right, in their church, okay? And then there'll be other Christians that are like, oh, they've made it a den of robbers, okay? They're buying and selling in there, and clearly that's what Jesus is getting at here. And then they get in a big argument, right? However, that's not really what's going on here. And I want to look at Mark's rendition of this, because in Mark 11:17, there's a little bit more detail that I want to add. So same story, same thing going on, but there's a little bit more that's been added, more detail that's been added. And he says, and he was teaching them and saying to them, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. So the only thing that's been added is we learned, oh, it's a house of prayer for all the nations, right? Not just the Jews, which may come as a little bit of a shock to you. But why is that detail important? Well, I'm going to tell you. So first of all, you may be asking, why are there money changers at the temple? And why are they selling pigeons, right? And we know they were selling other animals as well. Well, this is the temple. And to come and to worship God, you needed to, bring sacrifices. And so the intent, right? The intent was you'd bring a sacrifice from your flock, but if you couldn't afford one, you could buy one. So let's say you're back home and you buy a pigeon to make an offering. You bring it to the temple, and the priests need to look at it, right? And they'll be like, this one's got a defect, right? You can't offer defected stuff to the Lord. So you'd be like, okay, I walked all this way. I want to make my sacrifice. The pigeon's got a defect. And guess what happens? Hey, guess what? We've got some choice pigeons right here. Okay? And so we could sell that to you. And so they would sell them the pigeon, and then I don't know if they took this pigeon and just put it over there and then sold it to the next guy. I don't know. But I do know that, you know who ran the marketing scheme in the church? It was the priests. Right? And the money changing thing was, remember, the Jews had issue with, Caesar being on the coins, right? So certainly you can't give that money to God, right? You need money with the right guy's face on there, right? You need money that doesn't have a Roman ruler's face on it. So just so happens we can exchange your money for the good money so you can give it to the Lord. right? Of course there's got to be a little bit of markup, right? And so what Jesus is getting at is, you guys, what? You're selling and marketing and making money off of this that's supposed to be as a free will offering and worship of the Lord. And the reason I point out that in the other passage that it should become a house of prayer for all the nations, right? And this is important. And the reason it's important is, do you realize that where these exchanges were taking place was called the courts of the Gentiles? So if you were a Gentile and you wanted to come to the Lord, the true and living God, there was a place in the temple court for you to go. Right? So you could be a Gentile and you could still worship the Lord. Right? God's intent all along was that Gentiles would come to the Lord. What happens is they took that section and that's where they bought and sold. So in essence, they've pushed out the Gentiles, any hope of them coming, because now it's a marketplace. And they're making money. And it's, I don't know if you're tracking, when the priests are spying and selling stuff, you're like, that doesn't seem right, right? And currently there's a scandal about some basketball player, right? And she was betting on her own game. And who's the one? Pete Rose, right? Baseball player, famous baseball player. And everybody's all upset. And he's not in the Hall of, is he in the Hall of Fame yet? Nope, still out because he bet, not on a game he was playing in, but I guess he was the manager, right, the coach. And so they're like, oh, that's reprehensible. So you can't, right? We can see it when it comes to baseball, that you shouldn't be betting on a game that you have influence and control over. And here we have these priests that have influence and control, and they're getting rich. And Jesus doesn't like it. In fact, this is the second time he's actually done this. Right? This is the end of his ministry, but he also, we see in the book of John, that he did it at the beginning of his ministry. So he's cleansed the temple twice. So, the priests and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, right? All of them, even though they aren't necessarily all making money, they're like, this is kind of, don't like it. Right? You can see that's kind of ruffling feathers. So let's go on, verse 14. He says, and the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were indignant. And they said to him, do you hear what these are saying? And Jesus said to them, yes. Have you never read, out of the mouths of infants and nursing babes, you have prepared praise? And leaving them, he went out to the city of Bethany, and he lodged there. All right, let's break that down. So Jesus is in the temple. He's cleansed the temple, right? He's ruffled some feathers, and now he's healing people. It says that he's doing wonderful things, and they're miffed about the wonderful things. And even the kids are like saying, calling him Hosanna, Son of David. And the priests are like, are you not hearing this? And he's like, yeah, I am. Because out of the mouth of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise. What he's getting at, the young kids, right? And when we talk about young kids, we've seen it several sessions now where the kids are a picture of what you and I need to be like. And so here are these kids just seeing how good Jesus is, right? Imagine you're there. And you're a little kid, and your dad's all gimped up, and he's been lame for a long time, and Jesus heals him. You're like, oh, praise God, right? My dad's okay now. And it's just pure. And the leaders of the church at that time are indignant. They're like, oh, they shouldn't be doing that. And it's like, you don't even see what's going on. They're upset that their power and position is getting threatened. And so they're indignant with that. And Jesus is like, have you not heard? So it says that he went out to Bethany and he lodged there. So he came in, triumphal entry, he cleanses the temple, he heals some people, and he upsets the scribes, Pharisees, and the priests. Okay? So then he goes out, and it says he leaves. He doesn't spend a night in Jerusalem, but it says that he goes to Bethany. And because we are who we are, we might speculate, where do we know where he might have stayed when he went to Bethany? Lazarus' house, right? Mary, Martha, and Lazarus lived in Bethany. So probably a good chance that that's where he stayed. Am I going to be dogmatic about it? No. But this is an example of how the Bible, as we've said many times, is not like the Scout Handbook where you want to look something up, right? You just go to page 17 and it'll tell you how to build a fire. You got to read the whole thing. It's this big, huge story. And as you read it, it all ties together. And because we know that Mary, Martha, and Lazarus lived in Bethany, probably a really good chance that's where he stayed, right? It's some friends, just like he borrowed a donkey from some friends, some people that, it doesn't explicitly say it, but we've got a pretty good indication. All right, verse 18. In the morning, as he was returning to the city, he became hungry. Now, let me stop there for a minute, right? So he gets up in the morning, and if we speculate that he's, staying with Mary and Martha and Lazarus, what do we know about Martha? She's busy. She likes to put on a good show, right? And it's weird to think that Martha wouldn't have a breakfast prepared for Jesus, right? But I imagine Jesus got up early before Martha, right? And he's up praying with the Lord, right? Because he's got a lot going on. And so he leaves, and it says he became hungry. And it says, and seeing a fig tree by the wayside, he went to it and found nothing on it but only leaves. And he said to it, may no fruit ever come from you again. And the fig tree withered at once. And when his disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, how did the fig tree wither at once? And Jesus answered them, truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be taken and thrown into the sea, and it will happen. And whatever you ask in prayer, you will receive if you have faith. Okay, so let's break this down. This is the famous miracle of the withering of the fig tree. Something to think about. We only have record of two, what I would call destructive miracles of Jesus. Destructive miracles, yeah. He withered a tree, okay? So that wasn't directed toward a person, right? It wasn't. So what was the other destructive, what I would consider a destructive miracle? Oh, probably the swine running down the hill, right? That's destructive. Once again, it wasn't destructive towards people. In fact, we know that whole miracle changed an entire community, right? That was in the Decapolis, and the demoniac that those demons left. He ended up witnessing about what God had done to him. And then when Jesus, remember, and they told Jesus to leave, and he left. But he came back months later because that guy had gone out, and people at that point wanted to hear what Jesus had to say. And here, we've got this miracle. And I'll give you the mainstream common understanding of what's going on here. And that is the fig tree, it is withered. Okay? And typically, in the Bible, when we see the fig tree, we're reminded of Israel. Yeah. Israel, the fig tree is a picture of Israel. It's like this national tree, right? Like the United States has a national bird. The eagle. Okay. So back then, we see this connection with Israel and the fig tree. And the fig tree withers, and we look at that and we go, oh yeah, the nation of Israel is going to wither. Okay? And we see it's going to wither because it doesn't have any figs. And then there's this kind of transition into this whole thing about, well, If you see what happened to the fig tree and you pray, then all kinds of great things are going to happen. Right? And that seems a little bit disjointed in that understanding, but it's true that if you are in God's will and you pray and you don't have doubt, amazing things are going to happen. But I want to look at it a little bit differently today. So I'm going to look past what I call the geopolitical answer, and I'm not discounting the geopolitical answer at all, right? That this is a picture of Israel and that Israel will in fact wither, because that's what happened, right? For sure. But is there a personal and a deeper understanding of what's going on here? And I think so, and we're going to dive in and look at it. And as I've said many times, there's what I call hyperlinks. Right? Do we remember what the hyperlink is, right? That's when we see the underlined portion of Scripture, right, in our minds. And especially then, right? They didn't have hyperlinks like we have today. You know, like when you're on the YouTube and you see the underlined thing, you click on it, it's going to take you to another web page, okay? Well, I think that happened with stories, with scriptural stories, right? As Jesus is telling this, it talks about this fig tree that doesn't have fruit, okay? And that got me hyperlinking. And so what we're going to do is we are going to look at Judges 9, 7 through 15. Now I need to back up a little bit. And some of you may or may not heard this story before. So I got to give you a little bit of background. So Gideon, in the Old Testament, this is Judges. He's a judge. And this is after they come into the promised land, the children of Israel come into the promised land, and before the first king, there's this period of judges. Okay? And so Gideon is a judge. And so he goes and he does some conquering and some delivering of the children of Israel from the hands of Midian. Okay? And what happens is he conquers and he gets rid of their enemies, and the children of Israel are like, oh, this is great. Okay? We want to make you a king. In fact, look, we're going to look at that in a minute. So Gideon says, no, I'm not going to be a king. And they literally said, you can be king, and your kids can be kings, and your grandkids can be kings because you delivered us. Gideon's like, nah, that ain't how it's going to be, because God wants to be your king. Don't want an earthly king. And so what happens, one of Gideon's sons, Abimelech, is like, hey, that sounds pretty cool. Okay, so what he does, and Gideon, he had a lot of offspring, like 70 kids. Okay, not from the same woman, right? But he's got a lot of offspring. And so this Abimelech's like, man, that sounds like a pretty good deal. I want to get some of that action. So what does he do? He goes and he takes to killing his half-brothers. Wiping them out. And he gets them almost all wiped out until he gets to Jotham. And Jotham escapes. Okay? So that's the background of what's going to happen. So we're going to pick it up, Judges 9, 7 through 15. And we're going to read through this, and don't get freaked out if it sounds nutty. It says, when it was told Jotham, okay, that his brother Abimelech had killed everybody and wants to be king. So when it was told Jotham, he went and he stood on top of Mount Gerizim and cried aloud and said, here it is, listen to me, you leaders of Shechem, that God may listen to you. The trees once went out to anoint a king over them. And they said to the olive tree, reign over us. But the olive tree said to them, shall I leave my abundance, by which gods and men are honored, and go and sway over the other trees? And the tree said to the fig tree, come and reign over us. But the fig tree said to them, shall I leave my sweetness and my good fruit, and go hold sway over other trees? And the tree said to the vine, you come and reign over us. But the vine said to them, shall I leave my wine that cheers God and men, and go hold sway over the other trees? Then all the trees said to the bramble, come, reign over us. And the bramble said to the trees, if in good faith you are anointing me king over you, then come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, let the fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon. Okay? So, perfect sense, right? Okay, we might need to break it down a little bit, but are you at least getting that there's trees and fruit involved? For sure, right? That's the trigger. But what's happening is Jotham is saying, hey, I've got an illustration. And remember, the Bible is this intricate story and so much ties together. And think about the fact that for the vast majority of the lifespan of the Bible, people didn't have it in print. Right? They would only be able to memorize it because a lot of people couldn't read for most of the time in which we've had the Bible, okay? So think about back in this time, you've got this story that reveals this truth that would be a lot easier for you to memorize because you couldn't go back and look at the reference, okay? So that's why a lot of the stories are so colorful that bring forth this deep spiritual truth. And here's the truth. So what happens is Jotham says, hey, y'all want a king. Well, guess what? The trees, they said, we want a king. And so they went to the olive tree, and the olive tree is like, hey, I'm kind of busy here. I'm doing great things making olives, and olives are amazing, okay? And so then they went to the fig tree, and they said to the fig tree, will you be our king? And the fig tree's like, I'm kind of making figs, right? My figs feed people. They're sweet and delicious. And then the trees are like, okay, well, we'll go to the vine, right? We'll go to the grapevine. Hey, grapevine, will you rule over us? And the grapevine says, hey, I'm making grapes. With grapes, you can make wine. Got kind of an important thing going on here. And so the people are like, we need a king. So they say, hey, bramble. So do you know what bramble is? It's thorns. Right? Think of blackberries out here, right? So the trees go to the bramble and they say, hey, bramble, will you be our king? And the bramble's like, hey, you want a king? I'll be your king and you can get in my shade, okay? So does the bramble produce any fruit? No. Does the bramble have any shade? No. Okay, and so what Jotham is getting at is, and this is, there's a lot here, so I'm going to try to lay it out so it makes sense. But what Jotham's getting at is the only one that's willing to jump up and take charge has nothing to offer you. Nothing, right? And when we hear brambles and thorns, we should be thinking in our minds, right? Oh, thorns, that's part of the curse. Right? So the leadership that's willingly volunteering to do it has some connotation of the curse attached, right? These thorns and briars, right? It has nothing to offer the people. So, does that mean that only corrupt people take positions of leadership that have nothing to offer the people? Well, right? I mean, right? You look at it and you go, oh, wow. Yeah, so, and certainly that doesn't happen in politics today where, people that come into power, they have no money, but when they leave, they've got literal millions and millions of dollars, right? And maybe it's a coincidence, but it's probably not. So let's think about this big picture. What's it like for us? And that is that people that are productive, people that are producing good stuff, right? They're busy doing that. And so to take a position of kingship is a sacrifice, right? Because if the fig's going to jump in and be a king or a leader, it's like, well, I can't be doing what I'm doing. And so how does that work? Since I did use a political parallel, how does that work politically? Well, I think that people in politics, if you want a good one, it's going to be somebody that's like, yeah, I can do it for a while, but I can't leave everything because I'm not a bramble, right? And those are the people that you want in power, the reluctant leaders, because they're in there being productive and helping people, right? That's what those trees were doing. And let's look at Judges 8:23, because I want you to get the picture of what Gideon was getting at, right? And this is why his son Jotham was holding the line so hard. Okay, so this is Gideon. This happens before, right? Because this was an 8. And so this is when they wanted to crown Gideon king. It says, then the men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us and your sons and your grandsons also, right? We're talking kingship. Right? Your kids are all the way. Okay, stuff like that doesn't happen today, right? Say, this is hypothetical, but what if a congressperson dies and they're like, oh, what are we going to do? And then they appoint their sister in that position, right? Right? That doesn't happen. But that's what was happening here, right? They're like, hey, you know what? Your whole family is going to be part of this. And what happens is Gideon says, and they said, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian. Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. Okay? So, how does that tie in? Well, I think that as Jesus is looking at this fig tree, and there's no fruit, right? This illustration we just saw of leadership, right? Fig trees produce fruit, and they feed people. And Jesus is not necessarily speaking out against the nation, right? It's speaking out against the leadership of the nation, right? The scribes, the Pharisees, and even the priests, right? They don't have any fruit. We just saw, in fact, that the priests who are supposed to be feeding the people are making money off of them. Right? Does that sound like what the bramble was doing? Yeah, the bramble had nothing to offer. In fact, was taking. And so I think that Jesus is getting at this illustration that the leadership is a bramble. Okay, he's calling out the leadership as a bramble. And so what happens is this next section where he says, truly I say to you, this is verse 21 of Matthew 21. He says, for truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, it will happen. And whatever you ask in prayer, you will receive if you have faith. Okay, so how does this tie into the tree and the withering and the leadership? Okay, remember, Gideon said, hey, the Lord is to rule over you, right? Not a bunch of people. And so Jesus is coming and saying, hey, you know what? That leadership is all bramble, and it's going to wither. It's going to be nothing. So if the scribes, the Pharisees, the priests are gone, who's going to rule the people? Well, God is. However, you and I are going to fill the gap of the leadership, right? And how do we fill that gap, right? We need to be fruit trees, olive trees, and grapevines and feed people, right? We need to feed the people, and Jesus is giving and that's why I believe this is tied in, because you and I, right, are to replace these corrupt positions, the brambles, the corrupt positions of leadership. You and I need to step in that gap, and in this time, certainly the apostles, right? They stepped into this position, but Jesus doesn't dump us in there alone, right? He gives us the power. That's what this whole thing about power is. It's not so you can have a jet for your ministry, right? Oh, you pray hard and you can get a big jet. No, it's if you pray hard, it gives you the ability to minister people, to step into that gap where the brambly leadership had withered away. Does that make sense? So I think that's what's going on here. The guys can start passing out. But before I leave this, you might be saying, are you, Kevin, you do a lot of this jumping into the Old Testament. Are you sure Jesus was thinking about brambles and fruit, right? Was that ever really on his mind? And I would say that's a legitimate comment. We're going to look at Luke 6, 43 through 45. So this is Jesus talking. And you tell me, right? You tell me, did Jesus ever think in these terms of fruit and brambles and thorns and leadership and how we're to minister to one another? So in Luke 6, it says, "For no good tree bears bad fruit, nor, again, does a bad tree bear good fruit. For every tree is known by its fruit. For figs are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor are grapes pricked from bramble bush. A good person out of the good treasure of his heart produces good, and an evil person out of the evil treasure produces evil. For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks." So my point is, here's another example of Jesus with this same imagery about the trees that produce fruit and the trees that produce bramble. And if we're Christians, we're going to be producing fruit, right? And some of you might be like, well, I'm stumbled up on the fig, on the grapes, right? Because that produces wine. And okay, wine, Old Testament, in this time and culture, it just brings joy. It's not. Don't think of it in terms of problems with drinking, but just kind of cheers you up. Yeah. Okay, that's what we should be doing, is cheering one another up. We should be providing figs, right? Figs are actually, you ever had figs off a tree? I got a fig tree at my house. No, it's got figs, they aren't ripe yet, but I'll bring some figs if they get ripe. And so you and I think, need to be challenged to be fig producers, olive producers, grape producers, right? So we can encourage one another.